The shells are lifting. Through the smoke and cordite haze, shadows move, not shoulder to shoulder like the old way, but scattered, flowing like water through cracks in stone. In seconds, they'll hit the French trenches at Verdun. Most defenders won't even see them coming. This is February 1916, and you're watching the birth of modern warfare. But here's the twist that will haunt every general who learns this lesson. The very troops breaking the deadlock are signing their own death warrant with every success. What kind of unit is so effective that commanders throw it at every impossible job until almost no one is left standing? You're about to meet the Stormtroopers of World War I, the shock units that cracked the rules of trench warfare, then paid for those breakthroughs with their own blood. The plan that broke the stalemate also broke the men who carried it. Before we dive in, here's something that might surprise you. These weren't the sci-fi stormtroopers you're thinking of. George Lucas borrowed that name for a reason, because the original stormtroopers were so terrifyingly effective that their reputation echoed through history. But unlike their fictional counterparts, these men didn't miss their shots. They revolutionized warfare itself, and the cost was measured in empty bunks and unanswered roll calls. By the end of this story, you'll understand why modern special forces still use tactics pioneered in muddy trenches a century ago, and why every military academy still teaches the lessons written in blood by men whose names history barely remembers. The Western Front wasn't supposed to freeze. In 1914, leaders promised speed and glory, cavalry charges, bayonet rushes, victories measured in weeks. They got wire, mud, and machine gun belts that chewed entire battalions before breakfast. The sound was always the same: whistle, ladder, run, die, repeat. Artillery ruled from dugouts so deep you needed a map to find daylight. Attacks began with days of shelling and ended with men stumbling into enfilade fire that cut them down like wheat. Picture it. You're crouched in a trench, water seeping through your boots, rats the size of cats picking at yesterday's dead. The whistle blows. You climb the ladder, and in front of you stretches a moonscape of shell holes and twisted wire. Machine guns wait in concrete nests, their crews counting ammunition belts. Even when your wave somehow takes a trench, the counterattack comes before dark. You die for 50 yards that disappear by morning. Both sides were trapped in this equation of slaughter. Then soldiers started thinking smaller. What if you didn't fight the whole fortress? What if you flowed around it like smoke through a keyhole? Raids began as experiments. Men learned to read the landscape in darkness, watching for seams between units where sentries dozed or wire ran thin. If you could slip through a gap, you could throw everything behind the line into panic. That idea lived on both sides, but in Germany, it hardened into something more dangerous than anyone imagined. Stormtroopers, shock troops. The word carries weight even now. Short lines, not crowds. Fast moves, not ritual. Seize a foothold, then fan out like water, finding every crack in the dam. Here's the revolutionary change that commanders were slow to grasp. Orders stopped telling men exactly how to step and shoot. Instead, they wrote intent. Teams read the ground and decided in seconds whether to go left or right, whether to fight or bypass, whether to throw grenades or use the knife. If a bunker spat fire, you didn't die in front of it like tradition demanded. You passed it, cut its phone lines, and hit it from behind where the concrete was thin. Does that sound obvious now? In 1915, it was heresy. Armies had spent centuries teaching soldiers to stand in lines and follow commands. Now they were asking men to think, to act, to improvise with death breathing down their necks. Training followed the revolution. Men rehearsed on mock trench networks, learning to move through a landscape of corners and dead ends. Everybody carried grenades, not as backup, but as primary weapons. Stick grenades became their signature, perfect for throwing around corners into spaces you couldn't see. The sharp crack and flash cleared a dugout faster than any rifle. Light machine guns followed close behind the grenadiers. When the MP-18 submachine gun arrived, it gave them something new. compact automatic fire that could spray bullets in spaces too tight for rifles. Flamethrower teams added shock and terror. Defenders often ran just seeing the tank and nozzle, knowing what came next. But the equipment was only half the story. The mindset mattered more. You had to make life and death choices with your heart hammering and smoke burning your eyes. Could you keep your head while hearing nothing but your own ragged breathing and the wet sound of boots in mud? Early tests revealed something that terrified every general who saw the reports. When small teams moved fast and ignored the obvious targets, defenses that looked solid began to crumble like sandcastles. The outpost zone, the thin crust of sentries and wire in front, couldn't react in time. Communications snapped. Reserves moved to the wrong place. A hole appeared where a solid line used to be. The question flipped overnight from can you reach the trench to can the defenders stop you before you're past them? Then came the moment that announced Stormtroopers to the world. At Verdun, after a short, violent bombardment, assault teams crossed no man's land in loose groups. They didn't march, they flowed, using shell holes for cover, grenades leading the way. French defenders barely had time to climb from their dugouts before the forward trenches were overrun. If a bunker held, the Germans flowed past it like water around a stone, cutting phone lines and spreading confusion. Within days, a tiny raiding party, just 98 men, set their sights on Fort Douaumont, the crown jewel of Verdun's defenses. They crept forward in the pre-dawn darkness, found an undefended route through an open gun turret, and slipped inside like burglars. The garrison was caught completely off guard. The fortress fell with barely a shot fired. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. Fort Douaumont wasn't just any fortress. It was considered the strongest point and the strongest defensive line in the world. French engineers had spent years making it impregnable. The walls were 8 feet of reinforced concrete. The garrison had enough supplies to withstand months of siege. Military experts called it impossible to take by surprise. 98 German soldiers proved them all wrong in a single morning. When news reached Paris, panic spread through the government. If Douaumont could fall to a handful of raiders, what was safe? The psychological impact was crushing. If speed and stealth could humiliate France's strongest fortress, what fortress could stop them? From that moment, Allied soldiers lived with a new fear. These teams could appear anywhere, anytime, flowing through defenses like ghosts made of smoke and steel. Storm squads carried weapons chosen for one purpose: to kill quickly in tight spaces where every second mattered. They favored short carbines over long rifles, easier to swing around corners, faster to aim in the crush of a dugout fight. Sacks of stick grenades hung from every belt. Before entering any enclosed space, they threw first and asked questions later. The Luger pistol, with its distinctive shoulder stock and drum magazine, gave them rapid fire before the MP-18 arrived. When that submachine gun finally reached the front lines, it changed everything. Compact, fully automatic, deadly in the tangled maze of trenches, it was the perfect weapon for the new warfare. For the inevitable hand-to-hand fighting, they carried trench knives, shortened bayonets, and modified entrenching tools. These weren't weapons of honor, they were tools of butchery, designed for the moments when enemies met in darkness and only one walked away. Flamethrowers added a dimension of pure terror. The psychological effect was often more powerful than the flame itself. Defenders frequently abandoned positions just seeing the tank and nozzle, knowing what horror was about to be unleashed. Training tried to make chaos predictable, but nothing could prepare men for missions where death waited around every corner. They practiced in mock trenches, learning to move silently, to cut wire without sound, to coordinate attacks where timing meant life or death. When the real assault used creeping artillery, a moving curtain of shells that crawled forward ahead of them, timing had to be perfect. One miscalculation, one shell falling short, and your own guns would kill you before the enemy got the chance. Sometimes poison gas mixed with the high explosives, forcing teams to advance wearing masks that turned every breath into a struggle. Can you imagine creeping through enemy trenches half blind, breathing through cloth and charcoal, with your heart pounding so hard you're sure the enemy can hear it? By 1917, the stormtrooper approach had spread across the German army like wildfire. Commanders selected the best fighters from each division to form storm sections. Veterans from the original units traveled between sectors, teaching regular infantry the new tactics. Even the British, watching their defenses crumble under these attacks, reorganized their platoons to mirror the German model. The French remained cautious, never fully committing to large-scale storm units, but the Italians created their own equivalent, the RDT. These were borderline suicidal volunteers who often chose to fight with only knives, launching screaming charges that terrified Austro-Hungarian defenders. Their losses were catastrophic. Entire RDT units would vanish on missions with no survivors to tell what happened in the darkness. Then came Caporetto, October 1917. The name would become Italian shorthand for disaster, and for good reason. German and Austro-Hungarian forces struck with a short, brutal barrage mixing gas and smoke to blind and choke the defenders. As the last shells fell, stormtroops did what they did best. They found the seams, slipped through the gaps, and drove deep into the rear, before anyone understood what was happening. Within hours, the entire front split open. Storm units pushed 15 miles into Italian territory on the first day. What followed was less a battle than a collapse. Panic turned to mass surrender on a scale that shocked even the attackers. 265,000 prisoners, plus thousands more killed and wounded. Among the stormtroopers was a young lieutenant named Erwin Rommel. With just 5 men, he used speed, bluff, and sheer audacity to convince 1,500 Italian soldiers that they were surrounded by a much larger force. They laid down their rifles and walked into captivity. It was a master class in psychological warfare that would echo through Rommel's later career. Here's what makes Rommel's feat even more remarkable. He was just 25 years old, leading his first major independent action. The Italian force he encountered wasn't a rabble of demoralized conscripts. They were experienced mountain troops who knew the terrain. But Rommel understood something that wouldn't be formally recognized by military theorists for decades. In the chaos of modern warfare, perception often matters more than reality. By moving his tiny unit rapidly between positions and making noise in all the right places, he created the illusion of being everywhere at once. The Italians, already rattled by the unprecedented breakthrough happening all around them, faced what seemed like coordinated attacks from multiple directions. In the fog of war, 6 men became a battalion in the minds of defenders who had lost contact with their headquarters and had no idea how bad the overall situation had become. Caporetto proved the concept worked at any scale. It also planted a dangerous idea in every headquarters. If these troops can do this once, why not every time? That's where the bills started coming due. March 21st, 1918. Dawn breaks over a wall of sound that tears the air apart. Over 6,000 German guns unleashed 3.5 million shells in 5 hours. The British front disappears in smoke and flame. Gas blinds the outposts. Telephone lines go dead. Units lose contact before they know they're under attack. Then the infantry moves. Fast, loose, low, slipping through shell smoke and fog like hunting wolves. It's Operation Michael, Germany's last desperate gamble for victory, and it's the purest test of the stormtrooper idea the war will ever see. The first day feels like history snapping in half. Outpost lines crumble, forward companies pull back or simply vanish. British positions bend, buckle, then break completely. The Germans drive deeper than anything seen since 1914. In some places, they'll push 40 miles before the momentum dies. For a brief shining moment, it looks like the door to victory is finally open, but success carries the seeds of its own destruction. The very speed that made the breakthrough possible outran everything that kept an army alive. Ammunition ran low, then ran out. Food convoys struggled across cratered ground, where roads used to be. Medical teams couldn't reach the wounded. Some storm units stumbled into abandoned Allied supply dumps and wasted precious time looting because their own rations hadn't arrived in days. The punch was losing its shape, and the cutting edge was dulling fast. Here's where we need to talk honestly about what this cost. You're 21 years old. You've rehearsed the route a dozen times in training. You whisper the password, touch the grenades on your belt, and wait for the barrage to lift. When it does, the world becomes a ticking clock. You drop into a trench, shoulder first. 2 grenades, count to 3. Go! Your mouth tastes like chalk and copper. Your hands shake, but they remember the drill. You clear a dugout in seconds, then move again and again. The fear never leaves. You just learn to walk through it like walking through rain. Stormtroopers lived on that edge every single day. The work punished the body first. Blisters splitting inside wet boots, gas masks that clawed at your breath, ears that rang for days after the shelling. When food ran short, men fought on cigarettes and raw nerves. But the mental cost was worse. You slept light because you were always next on the roster for the impossible job. You came back from raids with your hands still shaking and pretended not to notice the blood when the smoke cleared. You watched friends disappear in sheets of flame and learned not to look too closely at what the shells left behind. Shell shock wasn't just a phrase. It was hands that wouldn't hold the cup steady, voices that cracked mid-sentence, men who forgot words or time or both. Some froze at the ladder. Others came back and stared at nothing for hours. The training had tried to make chaos predictable, but the real cost landed in quiet moments when someone tried to write a letter home they'd never send. Now, the brutal question everyone asks: did 90% of stormtroopers really die? The honest answer is more complicated and in some ways more tragic than the simple claim. That number comes from specific units during the worst periods, or from mixing casualties with deaths. But here's what we can say for certain. These were among the most dangerous jobs on the Western Front, and the longer you did it, the worse your odds became. The mathematics were cruel but simple. If you're the unit that works, you get sent to the hardest jobs. Not once, but again and again. You're first in and last out. That means more exposure, more chances for bad luck to find you. Storm units in 1918 were kept in continuous motion for days without relief. Exhaustion kills judgment as surely as bullets. A perfect drill in training turns sloppy on day 3 with no sleep. You miss a wire, you misread a corner, you step into a field of fire you thought was clear. Success isolated these units from everything that kept soldiers alive. Speed outruns supply wagons. Medics can't evacuate through territory you've just seized. The strong points you bypassed start shooting your runners, your stretcher teams, your ammunition carriers. Worst of all, the experience that made storm units effective couldn't be quickly replaced. A veteran squad wasn't just equipment and training. It was a living memory of dozens of raids, an instinct for reading ground and timing that took months to develop. When you lost that, you couldn't simply plug in fresh recruits and expect the same results. The spring offensive consumed Germany's best assault formations at a rate the army couldn't sustain. Some battalions were completely destroyed, their experienced fighters gone with no equivalent replacements. The follow-up attacks lacked the same bite because the cutting edge of the German assault had been worn away. By July 1918, the offensive had ground to a halt. The Allies, reinforced by fresh American troops, struck back with their own version of the same tactics. The exhausted German forces, their storm units decimated, could only retreat. November 1918, the guns finally fell silent, and the few surviving stormtroopers returned to a civilian world that seemed impossibly quiet after 4 years of chaos. They carried memories that would never fully heal: the weight of grenades on their belts, the taste of cordite, the sound a man makes when steel finds flesh in darkness. But the idea refused to die with them. Fire and movement, became the new rhythm of infantry combat. One element pins the enemy while another moves to flank, simple in concept, revolutionary in practice. Mission type orders spread too, give teams the objective, and let them figure out how to achieve it. If you've ever heard the phrase commander's intent, you're hearing an echo of those first storm units learning to think under fire. The tools evolved as well. Grenades went from backup weapons to primary assault tools. Light machine guns moved from rare assets to standard squad equipment. The submachine gun proved its worth in close combat, spawning generations of compact automatic weapons. Most importantly, infiltration taught armies to see defense lines as living systems rather than static walls. You don't attack a front, you attack joints, nerve centers, and weak points. Break communications and timing, and the whole position falls apart. Different scales, same logic. It's tempting to draw straight lines from World War I stormtroopers to modern special forces, but that oversimplifies the connection. The technology, missions, and contexts are vastly different now. What remains constant is the trust placed in small groups of soldiers at the point of maximum danger and the recurring problem of asking the same people to do the hardest job until they break. Let me be clear about what stormtroopers did and didn't accomplish. They didn't invent modern warfare. Other armies were evolving similar tactics simultaneously. British and French units absorbed and adapted infiltration techniques. Tanks, when they worked, changed the equation too. Artillery improved across all sides. No single innovation won or lost the war. Infiltration solved tactical problems brilliantly, but it couldn't fix strategy, supply lines, or the fundamental exhaustion of the German war machine. Verdun still became a charnel house. Caporetto led to Italian collapse, but not German victory. Operation Michael broke the deadlock temporarily, but couldn't deliver the knockout blow that might have ended the war. The real legacy isn't about superior tactics or wonder weapons. It's about the human cost of asking too much of your best people. The stormtrooper approach created a feedback loop that consumed its own foundation. The more successful these units were, the more they were used. The more they were used, the faster they burned out. That's the lesson worth remembering, not just for military history, but for any organization that identifies its highest performers and then runs them into the ground. Excellence is a finite resource. Use it wisely, or watch it disappear when you need it most. If there's a single image to carry forward, it's this. A small group moves through smoke-filled ruins, not knowing if the next corner holds salvation or sudden death. They carry grenades instead of certainty, speed instead of strength. They act because waiting is worse. They win minutes at a time, and those minutes sometimes add up to miles. When the smoke clears, maps look different, but the cost shows in empty places at morning roll call. Names that won't answer, voices that went quiet, hands that won't grip a rifle again. That's the story of the stormtroopers, not just the method they pioneered, but the people who made it work and the price they paid to prove it could be done. They broke the stalemate of trench warfare by breaking themselves, teaching lessons in blood that echoed through every war that followed. The trenches are quiet now, filled in or forgotten, but somewhere in the tactical manuals of every modern army, in the training of every special operations unit, in the doctrine of fire and movement that shapes infantry combat today, those shadows still move through the smoke, reminders of what happens when innovation and desperation collide on the battlefield. They solved the puzzle of how to break a deadlocked front. The answer was simpler and more terrible than anyone imagined. You send your best people into the worst places, over and over, until there's no one left to send. That's not just military history. That's a warning about the cost of asking too much of those who answer every call. Their story deserves to be remembered, not as propaganda for any cause, but as testimony to the human cost of wars. If this story moved you as much as it did us, please hit that like button so more people can discover these incredible tales, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe for more incredible stories of human courage and sacrifice in the face of impossible odds.